Let's talk about some of those weights on Donald Trump with former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade and NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney. And good morning to you both. Ken, I'll start with you about this deal, this bond deal for the former president with the Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis. $200,000, twice the other defendants, but also more specifically, Ken, these rules set out about threats and the cost of threats to Donald Trump if he goes after a co-defendant, if he goes after a witness, if he tampers with the jury, on and on down the list. What did you make of this? How unusual are some of these conditions of bond?
Well, Willie, what we know is that we didn't see those conditions imposed on any of the other co-defendants so far, and it was really striking. I mean, other judges in some of these other cases have verbally conveyed to Donald Trump or his lawyers that he shouldn't threaten or try to intimidate witnesses or potential jurors. This lays it out in black and white in very clear terms. He's not allowed to threaten or intimidate co-defendants, witnesses, potential jurors, or really anybody else. And specifically, it says, including by posts or reposts of material that others have posted on social media. That language included really struck a lot of people as very explicit, putting Mr. Trump in a box. Now, the issue here, of course, is how does the judge enforce it? Because there's a lot of people that look at this and say, Donald Trump would love nothing more than to have a situation where a judge is bringing him down to Atlanta, this judge, and potentially seeking to jail him because he would just make another appeal to his supporters and raise more money and declare himself a First Amendment martyr. So it's going to be really difficult for the judge in this case and all the other cases to try to decide where the line is between Donald Trump's First Amendment rights to political speech as he's running for president and tweets or other rhetoric that crosses a line into intimidation or threats. That's just a tough situation, and most experts believe they're going to give him a lot of latitude. And just one other separate point, what's happening Thursday is not an arraignment, it's a surrender only. He's going to be booked into the Fulton County Jail. That's what I think makes this different from all of the other situations, which were both sort of arraignments and surrenders, and I think to the public it got lost and it got translated as Donald Trump's appearing in court. On Thursday, Donald Trump is appearing in the Fulton County Jail, where he'll be fingerprinted and mugshotted. That's it. And so that's going to be a striking image for the former president of the United States at a local jail, guys.
And the area around that jail is going to be locked down when the former president arrives there tomorrow. So, Barb, that was my question for you about penalties. Let's say he violates some of these conditions of bond. He posts something, some threat, or even reposts something to one of the witnesses in this case. What realistically will happen to him?
Well, the judge has a few options. Some of it is a warning, which is probably the first step. The ultimate penalty, of course, would be to revoke the bond. The prosecutors know what they're doing here by negotiating this term. They see what is happening in all of these other cases where Donald Trump is posting these things. They saw what happened in this case where he made disparaging statements about one of the witnesses, the former lieutenant governor of Georgia. And so they're trying to stop that. But as Ken just said, I think it's going to be very difficult for a judge to use the ultimate hammer, which is to revoke the bond and jail Donald Trump awaiting trial. But I think Donald Trump doesn't want to mess around and find out, because that would be such a devastating consequence. I agree that maybe he wants to be a martyr for the First Amendment, but he also very much wants, I think, his liberty. Being jailed in the Rice Street jail while he awaits trial is certainly no picnic. And so I think we'll see things that come close to the line. I think he will try to push a warning before he goes any further, because it will be a difficult decision for a judge to revoke the bond. But if a judge is really doing his job, he is going to see that his job is to enforce the law and to manage this case, regardless of any political consequences that might come.
Ken, do you know, in terms of process, I know we saw the actual indictment live. Are cameras going to be in there? And then the other question is, what do we know about the other co-defendants making bond?
Yeah, the last I heard, we don't expect cameras to record the booking process. That's generally not done. I could be wrong about that, but that's the last I heard. We know that, for example, among the other co-defendants, John Eastman has posted $100,000 bond. And I believe there's a couple others. I'm not fully up to speed, but they all have to surrender before Friday. So we expect to see all of them one by one. As you mentioned, we saw one of the co-defendants, Jenna Ellis, complaining that Donald Trump is not taking care of her legal fees or helping out to defray her costs in any way. And you may see that sentiment uttered by some of these other people. Things are starting to get very serious for these people that allegedly engage in this conspiracy. Mika.
Barbara, the post that Donald Trump put out on Truth Social talking about Fani Willis and going to possibly Russia because they think he's going to skip jail. I mean, how close does that fall within the kinds of restrictions that have been placed on him? Is that the kind of thing he can post, or is that already sailing a little close to the wind?
I think it's close, but you'll notice that the terms really are about witnesses in the case and about the public and about inciting, civil unrest. And so I think the judge, I think the prosecutor might be fair game, but in terms of criticizing their motives and other kinds of things. But when it comes to threats, I think it's going to be different. So I imagine we will see Donald Trump skate as close to the line as possible. I think he knows he's going to get a long leash. He knows he's going to get at least a warning. And so I see him going after the prosecutor instead of the witnesses because she's a public official. And so, First Amendment rights when it comes to public officials offer a lot of leeway.
Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade and NBC's Ken Dilanian, thank you both very much for being on this morning.